the Stop Leaky Gut Challenge, using a systems approach to optimizing gut health. So this Stop Leaky Gut Challenge was kind of born, or came about, was born just as I was kind of, over the course of the last 2 years with the Hack Your Gut blog, I've just noticed that most information available on addressing gut health for people with gut disorders focuses on one of 3 topics, and that is either restrictive dieting, supplements, or pharmaceutical drugs. And it's not to say that those things are bad. It's just that I think that is an incomplete amount of information, and I have been, I follow a lot, I'm a member of a lot of groups, and I follow a lot of what people have going on, and I have noticed people are beginning to understand how powerful behavior is in improving gut health, whether it's people working on their circadian rhythms, or it's people doing time-restricted eating, or doing prolonged fasts. So the Stop Leaky Gut Challenge came about. I basically sat down and said, how am I going to look at gut health? And if I were to tell somebody this is how you optimize gut health, and this is the behavior that you should be exhibiting in order to have an optimal gut function, I just started plugging things away, started looking at things. And so, we have to realize that that's not to say that the 3 mentioned, restrictive dieting, supplements, and pharmaceutical drugs don't have their use. In some instances, they're very useful. But I don't feel that anyone has addressed how gut function is actually regulated. Look at basically all animals and hunter-gatherers. Most of them have absolutely no problem with their gut function, and that's because gut function is regulated primarily by our behavior. Gut function is under autonomic control, and so behavior plays a large role in how our gut functions. I do believe in many respects certain things that we do kind of pushes us towards poor gut function, but in the same respects, that means we can kind of identify the factors that are important for gut health and that promote good digestion and good gut health, and use those things to kind of direct us towards optimal gut function. So I don't know if you're aware, but my degree is in human factors and systems engineering, my undergrad degree. So I kind of look at things with a systems engineering approach. And a systems approach to gut health is absolutely necessary to ask the proper questions. Because not only is the gut a system, but the gut is a subsystem within the giant system that is who we are. So if we start approaching this from a systems engineering perspective, we can begin to ask the proper questions. Once we start asking the proper questions, we can begin to get the proper answers. So what do I mean by a systems approach to gut health? Basically, what I'm getting at is what causes the gut to function the way we want it to, and what causes it to, malfunction. So we know that the gut receives environmental signals through both the enteric nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Now, the enteric nervous system is the resident nervous system in our gut. And the autonomic nervous system is basically that part of our central nervous system that regulates automatic processes. So we're talking digestion, immunity, basically how sensitive the stress response is, sleep, etc., etc. So we have these 2 nervous systems that can work together, but in the same respects, they provide redundancy. And what that means is when one fails, the other can take over. So redundancy is very important in a system because things don't always go as planned. So you always want to have at least one redundant system to kind of take over. You probably understand a great analogy when you have like a generator on your house, and then the power goes out. You have the generator to kind of back up your refrigerator and all the essential things that you need in your house to keep going. You obviously don't want all the food in your freezer to thaw out, so you have that backup system. Now, how are these 2 systems regulated? Well, the enteric nervous system, the microbiome functions as Johnny on the spot for the enteric nervous system, and it does a lot. And it doesn't just do it on its own. The enteric nervous system as a nervous system has a sensory wing and a motor wing. So the sensory wing, kind of detects things going on in the digestive tract, and the motor system, the motor response, kind of causes changes in function based off of that information. So we have the microbiome teaming up with the enteric nervous system to kind of help regulate how digestion happens. However, The autonomic nervous system functions primarily through the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is front and center as the conduit of the gut-brain axis. So the vagus nerve can also regulate different aspects of our digestion. So both of these systems have a sensory wing and a motor wing. And so a good kind of analogy on this, or not even an analogy, example, is if we look at how the stomach functions. So the stomach, as it's empty for longer periods of time, begins secreting this hormone called ghrelin, which makes us hungry. But additionally, ghrelin causes, our stomach to begin secreting gastric acid. It increases gastric acidity. And when we eat our meals on a schedule, we get this kind of increase in ghrelin right before the scheduled feeding times. So here we can kind of see the sensory portion of this, an empty stomach. However, it's also regularly sensing timed meals, and so we will get a response to the motor side of things by having an increase in gastric acid secretion. And of course, the brain can play a role in this as well through the vagus nerve. So if we want to move along in this systems approach, we have to first identify what functions are important for optimal gut health. So we all have, are familiar with this, seen it discussed quite a bit, proper gut motility, enzyme synthesis and secretion, mucosal defense, which kind of refers to, producing a mucus layer that keeps bacteria away from the gut wall. But an additional aspect of that is secreting antimicrobial peptides to prevent something like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Replenishment of the intestinal lining, and what I mean by that is, the cells, the enterocytes and colonocytes, they basically kind of turn over every 3 days. So that needs to be optimal as well, because if that's not happening properly, you can have a damaged gut. You can actually, that's kind of what happens as we get older. We get this hyperproliferation, and so we over replenish the intestinal lining, and that's kind of what happens when polyps or tumors form. And then of course a healthy microbiome is important. So optimizing gut health centers around promoting the above mentioned functions through the appropriate behavior. So I think all of us kind of get buy-in to the importance of sleep, managing stress, and diet for gut health. But there are other factors that are important as well, such as physical activity, light exposure, meal timing, and fasting periods are also very important. So we don't just, it's not just, how sleep, stress, and diet affect our gut health. Optimal gut health is contingent on optimal system-wide communication. So, as I mentioned, sleep, managing stress, those kind of work on the gut-brain axis. But there isn't just a gut-brain axis. There's also the gut-liver axis. There's the gut-muscle axis. There's the gut-fat axis, and so on. All these tissues, you can throw in the kidneys there, as well as the adrenal glands that sit atop the kidneys. All of these are important for gut function, and gut function will in turn have an important impact on those. So here we'll just kind of discuss, we'll work on a few tissues here, kind of go over some stuff that you may not be aware of. So as I mentioned, the hunger hormone ghrelin is secreted as our stomach remains empty for longer periods of time, as well as based on meal timing in terms of scheduling. And this promotes gastric acid secretion. And so ghrelin also travels to the brain, across the blood-brain barrier, and that helps stimulate hunger. And that's going to drive us to eat, obviously. And so if you think about it, hunger is driving us to eat, it's motivating us to move, so it's working on the musculoskeletal system. But when gastric acid, you eat, gastric acid mixes with the food, and then that hits the duodenum, a hormone called secretin is secreted to modulate the pH in the duodenum. The duodenum does not do well with acidic pHs. So what secretin does is it decreases gastric acid secretion. It puts a stop to gastric acid release into the stomach and then eventually into the duodenum, but it also neutralizes duodenal acidity by causing an increase in pancreatic bicarbonate release. So if we're just, here we've talked about the brain, we talked about the stomach, we've talked about the duodenum, we've also talked about the pancreas. So, here you're probably thinking, well, yeah, that's just, still talking gut brain. But then we can take a look at what happens to secretin when it kind of affects the rest of our body. Specifically, it can work in the brain by decreasing appetite, but it doesn't work directly in the brain. When we get higher levels of secretin, this decreases our appetite by causing brown fat to become metabolically active. In other words, it causes brown fat, which is the fat that is metabolically active and increases heat production. When secretin hits that, so once we're in the fed state, this causes brown fat to become metabolically active, and more secretin causes more metabolically active brown fat. And what that does is that actually shuts down hunger. So here again, we're talking about the gut fat axis, specifically brown adipose tissue, but we have this signaling going on all around. And there was a recent study that looked at this, and they found that humans that made more secretin had more metabolically active brown fat. And in mice, if you kind of knocked out the activity in the brown fat, you didn't get the hunger suppression. So the fat is important to decrease appetite. So, just think about this. What happens if you inhibit acid secretion with something like a PPI or a histamine antagonist? You're going to kind of mess this whole communication system up. And this is all driven by behavior. So, throwing in something that just kind of, messes with the signal is not necessarily the best option. Factors optimizing intertissue communication. So, we're going to kind of just focus on the gut here. Physical activity impacts factors such as motility, bile output, bile acid recycling, and the microbiome. Specifically with the microbiome, adequate amounts of physical activity increase the amount of butyrate-producing species, so that actually promotes a healthy environment that allows a healthy microbiome to grow. Meal timing and frequency regulate motility, enzyme synthesis and output, bacterial load, the microbiome, and the migrating motor complex, which I've discussed on the blog several times. Sleep and stress modulate the autonomic nervous system, which affects it all. And we can actually take it a step further if we go to physical activity. That's going to affect the autonomic nervous system, and as is meal timing and frequency. Anything that kind of has an effect on either cortisol or insulin is generally going to have an effect on the autonomic nervous system. And finally, nutritional factors can be used to power physiological pathways, promote stem cell maintenance, and promote proper cell turnover. So what I mean by that is there's certain factors in food that we need that will promote this. And a lot of you are probably familiar with a lot of those as essential nutrients, but there are other factors, and some of these factors are contained in foods such as wheat, soy, and dairy that people avoid. And for certain nutrients, those are the most important sources. So when you cut them out, you dramatically decrease your exposure to these nutrients. There's great individual variability on the best way to do things, whether it's, what, when, or how much. Most people ask me, when should I have my first meal? If I drink coffee, when should I drink it? When should I do my physical activity? What type of physical activity should I do? When should I do this? And so the answer to that is not ever cookie cutter. There's so much individual variability on the best way to do things that you really can't kind of address that with saying, oh, you should do 20 minutes of exercise at 7 a.m. every day. So for example, high levels of physical activity are probably ideal. I'll tell you personally, I get somewhere around between 600 and 700 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a week. And if somebody has a major gut problem, that is not going to be a good situation. Or for somebody who's stressed out. So what's optimal isn't necessarily what is the most effective to get you from the point you are to an effective that will get a point that will get you to optimal. So it's really important to point out it matters where you are. You're not necessarily in the same spot as me. Another example is kind of, I would say most people are not going to get up as early as I do because I have to. So what I do from certain aspects of my lifestyle are not perfect, but I know what to do to kind of troubleshoot around that. So you can't get a single, 2-sentence blurb on what's optimal. So, but what's important is, you don't just make a change. You don't only need to change lifestyle. You need to measure your response to that change and identify if it's right for you. And this allows us to optimize it to the individual, and it also gives us a clear path to ideal. It might not be a completely linear path to ideal, but we can look at certain things. Certain things are going to be outside of your control. You might go to a birthday party and have something that's not necessarily right for you. Maybe you're lactose intolerant and you have ice cream. So what? It happened. We need to know what to do when that happens, and we need to know, you don't need to freak out about something like that, because there are certain things you can do. For example, I've never been able to tolerate ice cream and milk, but I've actually tolerated it quite well over the course of the last year. I'm talking about even when I was in my 20s, if I have a cup of milk, or chocolate milk, or even a bowl of ice cream, my stools would get super loose. But I don't remember the last time I had an issue with loose stools, and that's because I'm crossing my T's and dotting my I's all over the place. So small perturbations are not going to cause a problem. So the Stop Leaky Gut Challenge, what is this going to be about? We're going to be modifying the aforementioned factors and measuring progress. We're basically I'm gonna sit down. We got some presentations I have for people. I'm going to tell them, hey, this is what you need to do. This should be the core of what you do. Oh, and here's some extra things you can do if you want to do it. And here's what you should do if, maybe you can't hit the main criteria, you need to do these things. And we're going to measure compliance with a case report form. Case report form is basically something you use. Think about case studies, or even in most clinical research, you make a case report form so you can collect data. We're going to collect data not only to measure compliance, to make sure people are doing these things and making a score. This is going to allow us to make adjustments to individualize the program to the person's needs and their lifestyle. We're going to understand optimum. Optimum may not necessarily be where you are right now, but it's where we want you to get. Whether that happens over the course of the 12 weeks of the program doesn't matter. My goal is to give you the tools to get there, and to have the workarounds that I've mentioned when optimum is not attainable. We're going to know the factors regulating gut health are the same whether you have a gut problem or are healthy and looking to optimize health span. I use these same principles to fix my gut problems when they were a problem. They haven't been a problem in probably maybe 2 years. I don't know exactly, but I've been working towards optimal and kind of sitting there for well over a year. And it's great. I can drink beer. I can't think of any food I don't tolerate very well that will cause an immediate problem. I could go back to the wrong way of doing things, or I can just start eating 24/7 and screwing up my digestion. But when you know the system that you're working with, you kind of have an idea of what you can do and what you can get away with. So, most of the people in the program, I think it's probably all the people other than me and a couple other people, are in the former. They're people who have gut problems that they're trying to fix. They're not going to optimum. And like I said, definitely under a handful, maybe 2 or 3 people in the challenge are people looking to optimize their gut health so they can optimize their health span. And the challenge, as I mentioned, the challenge will be 12 weeks, but it's not really ever over. That's kind of why I made it as something for the Circadian Retraining Program people, because I follow up with those people all the time, and that will allow me to, once we get past the 12 weeks, kind of keep goosing them into the direction of optimal. And finally, it's only competitive between you and yourself. You're not competing with me. I'm not competing with you. You're not competing with Steve or Jane or Coraline or anybody. We're just using the point scoring system is just to kind of give me an idea of how compliant you are, so we can determine if we need to be more compliant and measure other things. So these are the goals of the challenge. And when I say these are the goals of the challenge, these are what I hope people get from it. I want people to understand the lifestyle factors that affect gut function. These are very useful tools, and I want people to understand the game that they're playing and the rules of the game. I want them to identify the factors holding them back. I want people to understand that, for example, probably one of the worst things you could do for yourself is to eat late at night. And if you're somebody who does that, you cannot expect to have a healthy gut function. And ultimately, if that's a very common thing that you do, that's common behavior, I'd be absolutely surprised if you have healthy metabolic health for long, and that throws everything off. So I want people to identify the things that are within this checklist of things I'm having them do, to understand, hey, I need to work on this, and maybe I don't do it every single day, but I need to make progress towards it. I want the implementation of healthy habits to drive their gut health. It's not just about knowing, it's knowing about how to implement things. Working in the weight loss field for so long, when I was in college and early in my career, most of the impediments aren't people not knowing what to do. It's in people being able to implement the information and to put themselves in situations to succeed. For example, people trying to lose weight shouldn't have snacks around their house. I don't have snacks around my house. I do eat snacks, but I make it as difficult as possible to acquire them so that I eat less of them. So implementation is equally important as the information being given. I also want people to have all the workarounds to make consequences of deviations not as bad. I mentioned that I drink alcohol. I need to if I'm drinking alcohol, I need to time my coffee appropriately, or that can be a big mess the day after drinking alcohol. Diarrhea is never great. It's not great for your gut. So understanding that and understanding, if you do, several things that set you off in the wrong direction, especially those two things, alcohol and coffee, have an effect on the circadian rhythm. So it's really important to know that if you're going to go partying with your friends, you need to time your coffee appropriately or not at all, depending on what you went through the night before. I also want people to understand how to measure progress. I don't think many people are doing that. I think people are just kind of cutting things out of their diet and just kind of hanging out. So I want people to understand how to measure progress, whether that be using an activity tracker to measure sleep, physical activity, heart rate, using heart rate variability, or using the subjective questionnaire that I will also be giving with the case report form. And I want people to make long-lasting changes that will promote long-term success. Ultimately, based off of the people who have been in the Circadian Retraining Program for the longest amount of time, people didn't do stuff for a week and it got better. People typically did stuff for a couple of weeks and they noticed some weird things that they hadn't, experienced in many years. For example, some people, had diarrhea every day, and then they noticed they only had diarrhea, every other day, and then after a couple of months they hadn't had diarrhea in 3 weeks, and then after 6 months they've only had 1 or 2 bouts of diarrhea in the last 3 months. So it's important to understand that long-term success is the ultimate goal. So the 12 weeks of this program is not the end-all be-all for most people. I every day focus on my gut health and behaviors that will promote my gut health, because I do believe gut health is one of the most important things for maintaining health throughout the lifespan and preventing chronic disease. So that basically covers the whole presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, if you're interested in joining the Stop Leaky Gut Challenge, I will post a link to the signing up and, of course, the payment. And if you're not, I will definitely be discussing this in the podcast, so follow the podcast. Alrighty, thank you very much. Bye-bye.